dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Andrew back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're continuing our conversation on the Supreme Court and universal injunctions with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Scott, speaking of these universal injunctions, so are they fairly common? Were they fairly common prior to this Supreme Court ruling?
Well, I'll tell you what, I've got in front of me some numbers just to give you a sense of how this has affected Trump, and you were making the point of why it's such a big deal. George Bush was subject to 6 total injunctions in his 4-year presidency. President Obama was subject to 12 in his 8 years of being president. And by the way, the numbers I'm reading you are published from the Harvard Law Review from 2024, before Donald Trump resumed the presidency in his second term. So these are first term only numbers and compiled by an organ that is, might say at best, skeptical of Trump rather than, if not outright hostile to him, right? So in any case, 6 for Bush, 12 for Obama. Donald Trump, 4-year presidency, 64 nationwide injunctions. And Biden had 14 in his single term in office. So
now, I'm going to play devil's advocate quickly here, Scott. Some people would argue, not me, but some people would argue that, well, that's because he broke the law more. Does that argument hold water, Counselor?
So the injunction isn't about whether somebody broke the law. And just to be clear, like I'm approaching it from the actual literal kind of application of the law. And what the ruling is that what those judges were ruling on was that the Trump administration was likely to lose, and that therefore they were able to grant those injunctions unguided by this notion that the Supreme Court just enforced with the CASA ruling, that they shouldn't do that at all, basically. It just kind of crept into the law where they were doing it more and more. And the Supreme Court had kind of beaten around the bush about it, but they never really got down to brass tacks and addressed the question directly, which is why this is such a major case and will change so much. I would say to you, for your devil's advocate question, that well, read the Supreme Court opinion, and you'll see why I think that's a bad idea.
No, I think so. I mean, my thoughts on that specifically are that when Donald Trump won the election in 2024, November 2024, Democrats said that leading Democrat voices were saying that we're going to take him to court, we're going to sue him, we're going to hold him to account through the law courts. And they fundraised on it. And there are multiple organizations that are linked to the Democratic Party whose sole purpose is to sue Donald Trump and the Trump administration. So I would imagine
to great effect, by the way.
To great effect,
they've done
absolutely.
Very well with their campaign. I mean, you look at that 64 universal injunctions, that is quite a success if you're trying to stymie an administration's implementation of their goals.
So how many of these were filed in Alabama, by the way?
I don't know, but actually, if you think, really, Alabama is not the kind of place where you get this kind of treatment. You get it from mostly a northeastern or West Coast judge.
Yes.
Just because that's where the more radical ones seem to be appointed to, and then to the appellate courts growing from there, by the way.
So it really was a case of shopping around for a judge that's most likely to, or it appears to be a case of shopping around for a judge that's most likely to be favorable.
No, I think
position.
You file in a district where you get you have a odds-on better chance, but no, judge shopping is a bit too risky. One thing you could say is, so if we think about how these cases are, well, previous to the new landmark ruling that the Supreme Court sent down this past Friday in June, how it would work is the case goes before a district court judge. That judge, let's say they do issue a nationwide injunction. Then it goes to the appellate courts for for them to look at before it might go to the Supreme Court. Well, you may choose which circuit you bring the case in just because you want to get a favorable ruling at the circuit court level, or excuse me, the circuit court of appeal level. But even then, if you just get a how this is a bit inside baseball, but if we really want to talk about the mechanics of it, you have to get into it. Those appellate courts often assign a 3-judge panel to look at these different cases, and they don't do it with. It's not like, oh, hey, you like politics, right, Mark? You can go look at this case. No, it's all very much randomized, and who gets these cases is not selected based on the president that nominated the person for their appointment or anything like that. And so you can game it a little bit maybe, but boy, of all the things to try to control outcomes for, it seems like you're better off spending a little more time on your brief maybe than trying to get a favorable particular judge.
Okay, so from here on out, judges will be able to, district court judges will be able to grant the relief that they see fit for the individual. The lawyers in the case will be able to seek to create a class action with a number of litigants. But what happens if somebody does order a universal injunction? How does that get stopped?
Well, we can just say,
is there a time?
We can just say when, I think, instead of what happens, because at some point it's going to happen, and it'll go. Well, what happens is when that case then goes before the Court of Appeals, which it almost certainly will.
Yeah.
The Court of Appeals will now have this Supreme Court guidance to look at, and it'll be, instead of I don't know if rubber stamp is exactly the word I want to use to describe how the Courts of Appeals have been handling these things, but without much of a scrutiny that really examines, like, is this absolutely required to gain the relief that for these parties? So basically what it does is it creates another stopgap for the administration to not have to comport with that universal injunction and have it lifted. And I expect we'll see that happen with most of any that do get through, which is that the appeals courts will look at it and say, no, you didn't do a good enough job tailoring the remedy to the specific parties in front of you, which doesn't require that, and either instruct them to work harder to do it again, or to enact their own order that, to their mind, tailors an order, to the parties in front of the court without a nationwide injunction. And then it also, Mark, will go one more bite at the apple. Then the Supreme Court has the capability, without the full case briefing, of smiting down that district court judge. So, for instance, appeals, they call it the emergency docket. It's rarely an emergency, with the exception of some death penalty cases. But what happens is, when there's a case that comes out of, let's call it the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is where I'm talking to you from now, and it comes out of the Fourth Circuit, well, if the litigants don't want to wait for the Supreme Court to look at their case and rule on it in a timely fashion, they may apply for urgent review, in which case one particular justice is assigned to each of the circuits. I forget I should know this cold, and I'm sorry I don't. I should know who the Fourth Circuit judge is, but in any case, they will look at it and they will say, okay, if it's an easy kind of pitch for them to hit, they'll just say, this is the rule, do it this way. If it's a more contentious issue, they'll sometimes refer it to the whole court. But what I expect to see is more of those justices then saying, no, this does not pass muster for a universal injunction. So basically, at every step now, where there had been maybe a veil to pass through or some rice paper in terms of legal resistance, once the district court judge gave that universal injunction, now it's the opposite of that. Now it's a brick wall in front of them that they're going to have to keep going over.
We're going to be talking about that brick wall made by Justice Amy Coney Barrett after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.